Long before most people called it a Nigerian Prince scam, the pattern already existed. An unexpected message arrives. It promises an extraordinary opportunity, and it asks the recipient to help unlock money that is supposedly stuck behind paperwork, politics, or banking procedure. The message is written to feel official, urgent, and flattering because the recipient is being chosen for a special role. By the 1980s and 1990s, this style of fraud had traveled through postal mail and fax, then steadily into email. The name 419 became widely associated with the scam because it references a section of Nigeria's criminal code dealing with fraud, and the term spread internationally as people compared stories about similar letters. Most people imagine the Prince version as a small-time trick aimed at individuals, but one real case shows how the same psychological design, authority, secrecy, and the promise of outsized reward could be scaled dramatically. In the mid-1990s, a senior figure connected to banking in Nigeria, Emmanuel Nwude, became central to an advance fee fraud that targeted a Brazilian institution and unfolded through extended, persuasive communication rather than loud confrontation. The victim organization was Banco Noroeste, based in São Paulo, operating at a time when cross-border finance was expanding quickly, and oversight across jurisdictions could be slow, fragmented, and easy to confuse with complexity. In this story, the prince costume is replaced by something even more convincing: the impression of government and central bank authority. According to multiple accounts of the case, the pitch involved a supposed major infrastructure investment, an airport project in Abuja, and communication that nudged a bank decision-maker to treat the request as both prestigious and confidential. This is where the old correspondence scam reveals its true strength. It does not need harsh language or chaos. It works best when it sounds calm, procedural, and above your pay grade. It invites the recipient into a private story where asking too many questions feels like a failure of professionalism. In the Nwude case, the communication continued over time, months turning into years, until the sums involved became staggering. Public reporting and case summaries commonly cite a total around $242 million transferred over the period from 1995 to 1998. The key educational lesson at the start is simple: the Nigerian Prince scam is not defined by a prince or even by email. It is defined by a narrative technique, one that can be adapted to whoever the recipient most trusts: a noble figure, a lawyer, a senior official, or a top executive. In this story, the costume was credibility itself. As the correspondence developed, It relied on a quiet, powerful idea that the recipient was being given privileged access. This is a hallmark of classic 419 scams. The message frames the situation as rare and time-sensitive, and it flatters the recipient as trustworthy, discreet, and uniquely positioned to help. In the Banco Noroeste case, accounts describe how the approach presented an investment opportunity tied to a major project, with the recipient encouraged to see themselves not as a victim, but as a partner in something significant. The supposed deal offered extraordinary upside, and in exchange, the recipient was asked to move money in ways that were presented as temporary, strategic, and eventually rewarding. The identity element mattered. Descriptions of the case note impersonation of senior institutional authority connected to Central Bank of Nigeria, because nothing calms doubt like an implied link to the top of the system. Classic Prince letters often succeed by turning skepticism into embarrassment. If you question too hard, you might look distrustful. If you hesitate, you might miss the opportunity. The correspondence is designed to make doubt feel like a personal weakness rather than a rational response. In many advance fee scams, the request begins small, not necessarily in amount, but in emotional commitment. The recipient is first asked to do something that feels reasonable, communicate privately, keep the matter discreet, move a portion of funds, help with paperwork, or handle a transaction that can be explained as routine. Each step creates a sense of momentum, and the recipient starts to protect the story because they have already participated in it. That is why these scams can last many years. They are not always a single message. They can become a relationship of persuasion, where the sender gradually trains the recipient to accept the logic of the story. The recipient begins to interpret contradictions as complications, and complications as proof of how real the situation is. In this case, the sums reportedly moved were enormous, again widely cited around $242 million over 3 years, but the mechanism is the same as in the small familiar letters, a grand promise and a request to act now, quietly and repeatedly. One reason the case is still discussed is that it shows how a correspondence scam can exploit not only greed, but also status. The recipient is made to feel included in elite circles, banking, government, infrastructure, international deals. The sender does not need to shout, they only need to keep the recipient inside the room emotionally. Another reason is that the scam leveraged cross-border complexity. When money moves across jurisdictions, accounts, and intermediaries, it becomes easier for a persuasive story to hide behind phrases like processing, clearance, international requirements, or temporary holding. In many victims' minds, confusing details become a substitute for proof, and so the correspondence continued until something in the real world interrupted the story. Not a dramatic confession, but a corporate process that demanded reality, oversight. Large institutions can carry unusual transactions for a long time when a trusted insider believes they understand the reason. That is why the turning point in this case was not a sudden moral awakening, it was organizational friction. As accounts describe it, the fraud began to unravel when an acquisition process forced outsiders to look closely. In 1997, Spain's Banco Santander was involved in due diligence connected to Banco Noroeste, and questions were raised about why a very large sum of money was sitting in offshore accounts without proper monitoring. One of the places repeatedly mentioned in summaries of the case is the Cayman Islands, not as a symbol but as a practical detail. Funds parked far from the everyday visibility of most colleagues, where temporary can quietly become permanent. This is where the educational value becomes sharp. A classic 419 narrative survives as long as it can keep the recipient isolated, emotionally and procedurally. Due diligence breaks isolation. It introduces new eyes, new questions, and new standards of evidence. It forces the story to be repeated to people who are not invested in believing it. In many long-running correspondence scams, the sender anticipates suspicion and supplies reassuring explanations. The more questions asked, the more documentation is offered, the more official the tone becomes. But due diligence is designed precisely to resist tone. It asks, where is the independent confirmation? Where is the internal record? Why does this transaction exist? As the inquiry deepened, the gap between the persuasive narrative and verifiable fact widened. This led to broader investigations and to the recognition that a huge amount had been siphoned away under a false premise. The aftermath also shows how corporations contain reputational risk. Reports indicate that to proceed with the acquisition and stabilize the situation, the owners of Banco Noroeste covered the loss themselves, and the bank later collapsed in 2001. From a documentary perspective, this is the quiet tragedy of institutional fraud. Even when a bank is the immediate victim, the consequences spread outward: employees, customers, markets, and public trust. And unlike a simple Prince email, the institutional version can damage systems people rely on daily. This part of the story ends not with a dramatic scene, but with paperwork, audits, and the unstoppable momentum of formal scrutiny. Once the bank's internal story was questioned by external reviewers, the fraud could no longer live comfortably inside private correspondence. Now the narrative shifted from persuasion to accountability. When a case crosses borders, it also crosses legal systems. Summaries of the Banco Noroeste fraud describe investigations involving multiple countries, reflecting how money movement creates an international puzzle. different banks, different regulators, different records, different timelines. Inside Nigeria, the early 2000s were also a period when the government was under strong pressure, domestic and international, to respond more aggressively to financial crime. One major institutional response was the creation of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission in 2002, an agency that quickly became a symbol of a new enforcement posture. The Banco Noroeste case soon became one of the most prominent public tests of that posture. According to reporting and case summaries, arrests and charges followed in 2004, with multiple defendants linked to the scheme appearing in court proceedings in Nigeria. What makes this phase important for education is that it shows the scam's full life cycle. Many people think the Nigerian Prince email ends with a victim's loss and a blocked sender, but major 419 cases can transform into multi-year legal struggles, asset seizures, restitution claims, and court decisions that determine whether victims recover anything at all. It also shows how the label classic can be misleading. The scam format may be old, but the surrounding infrastructure, global banking, offshore accounts, international acquisitions, created a modern stage where an old narrative could produce huge consequences. A common misconception is that these frauds rely on technological sophistication. This story argues the opposite. The most advanced element is often social, the ability to maintain a convincing relationship over time, to adapt explanations when questioned, and to keep the recipient emotionally committed to the story. In this case, the victim was not an inexperienced internet user. It involved a bank director, complex transactions, and professional contexts, and yet the old design still worked. A promise, an official-sounding identity, and a long chain of correspondence that made the false story feel increasingly real. By the time the case reached court, it had become more than a scandal. It had become a public lesson that long-running correspondence fraud is not a joke, not a minor annoyance, and not limited to naive targets. Under the right conditions, it can reshape institutions and trigger major enforcement reforms. Courtrooms do not move at the speed of email. They move at the speed of evidence, procedure, and argument. But for victims of long-running fraud, court is often where the story finally becomes factual. Names, dates, amounts, and consequences. In the Banco Noroeste case, public reporting and legal summaries describe convictions in 2005 tied to the advance fee fraud, and the case is frequently referenced as a landmark example of 419 enforcement. A key detail that often gets missed in casual retellings is the recovery process. In November 2005, reporting noted that Nigeria's Financial Crimes Agency returned $17 million to the Brazilian bank, described as the first installment of funds tied to the larger amounts siphoned in the scheme. That single number matters educationally because it shows what recovery often looks like: partial, gradual, and dependent on legal pathways. People who receive Prince emails sometimes imagine that if authorities get involved, money will simply come back. The reality is far more administrative. Funds can be traced, frozen, contested, and returned in pieces, or not returned at all. Another important educational point is that high-profile cases can change behavior even beyond the defendants. When agencies demonstrate they can seize assets and return money, it can discourage some future attempts, and it can encourage victims to report incidents instead of staying silent. At the same time, the persistence of Nigerian Prince-style scams over decades shows that enforcement alone does not erase the underlying vulnerability: human hope mixed with urgency. In this phase of the story, the scam is no longer a persuasive message. It is a record. Filings, judgments, restitution amounts, and institutional reputations. The correspondence that once felt private is now dissected publicly and professionally. And yet, even here, the quiet genius of the 419 pattern remains visible. It is built to make victims reluctant to speak early. Shame is a powerful silencer. Many classic Prince letters are designed so that victims feel complicit in something embarrassing, so they hide it, and the fraud lasts longer. This is why the Banco Noroeste case is so valuable as a documentary example. It forces the viewer to confront a simple truth. These scams can persist for years, not only because senders are persistent, but because the story manipulates normal human emotions: trust, ambition, discretion, and the desire to be chosen. If the Nigerian Prince scam is so famous, why does it still work? The answer sits inside the structure of the story itself. It is flexible, it can change costumes, it can travel across media, it can target individuals or institutions, but it always keeps the same backbone: a spectacular claim and a request that moves the recipient from curiosity to commitment. The Banco Noroeste case shows the institutional version of that backbone. Instead of a prince, the story leaned on the aura of official authority and major infrastructure. Instead of a small transfer, the amounts reportedly grew to a scale that became globally notorious: around $242 million across the scam period. This case also demonstrates how scams evolve with communication technology. The classic letters were written to look like formal correspondence. As email became universal, the same tone moved online. Today, messaging apps and social platforms can play the same role, private, direct, and capable of creating a relationship that feels real because it is continuous. But the deepest lesson is not about the channel. It is about the emotional mechanics. Extraordinary opportunity, the promise is bigger than everyday life. Authority costume, the sender sounds connected to power. Confidentiality request, isolation becomes framed as professionalism. Time pressure, reflection feels like a risk of missing out. Incremental commitment, each step makes the next step easier. In the Banco Noroeste story, these mechanics helped sustain years of correspondence until corporate due diligence finally forced the narrative into daylight. And even after the case reached court, the aftermath shows how long consequences last. Investigations, convictions, and partial restitution over time. So, when people joke about the Nigerian Prince, they often miss what the history is really saying. The joke persists because the story is memorable. The scam persists because the psychology is timeless. This case ends as many educational stories end, not with mystery, but with clarity. A classic correspondence scam is not old, it is durable. And the reason it is durable is that it speaks to human imagination, then asks imagination to pay a fee to become real. That is the enduring power of 419 style fraud, a story that travels across decades, crossing from paper to fax to email, always searching for a moment when hope becomes urgency and urgency becomes action.